Hi, it's Liz. I'm here for my Thursday video every Thursday. And it's every Thursday because that's the day that I have my young child in childcare. So I can spend the day getting housework done and relaxing and making a video like this. Um, and normally I have to do it like when she's asleep, or I have to like deal with the fact that she's probably going to interrupt the video a whole bunch. And I don't like that. It's hard for me to concentrate. I mean, I know she's cute, but I'm thinking that's as cute as she is, I'm thinking she's probably not the draw for my videos. People aren't like clicking on bipolar disorder videos and hoping to see adorable toddlers. So, yeah. If you'd like to support me in making more videos like this, and making them better, like taking more time to learn how to edit them and get editing software. And there's so many things I could do to make these videos better and to make more of them. Just look down in the description and you can support me on Patreon. Anyway, today's topic I just got the inspiration to last night because I started listening to Golden Brown by the Stranglers. Every time I listen to that song, it reminds me of so viscerally of the experience of being high on heroin. And that's what the song's about. I mean, it's not hard to figure out, especially if you're at all familiar with heroin. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about heroin and how it relates to mental health, and specifically heroin addiction and how it relates to mental health. And this is just from my personal experience and the experiences of people that I know, people I've talked to. So it's all anecdotal. But I just wanted to talk about this because I know that, well, for one thing, I know there's a lot of people who can relate, and then it's really nice when you find people who understand heroin use, like people who get it, because I think to a lot of people there's it's just so stigmatized that people don't understand why you would start doing it in the first place. And um and for the people who don't really know much about it, there's a lot of misconceptions um about how heroin addiction happens and stuff. um and I just want to talk a little bit about how I've used it to what's the word? Self-medicate. And it's something a lot of people do. So to start off, um just like looking at my past. I mean, I know a lot of people who have used heroin at some level. I know a few people who have died from overdoses. Um the people I was close to. And I think pretty much everyone in like sort of subculture communities, like punk, goth kind of world, like I think we all know somebody. We probably all know several people who died that way in their 20s. Um, and yeah, that's definitely what people think of when they think of heroin. They think of like junkies who overdose, and that's real, of course. That's not like that's a is that a stereotype? That comes from a real place. There's also, I think what people don't realize is that there's a lot of people who can use heroin recreationally without becoming, physically addicted. Um, a lot of people use heroin without shooting it up. I never shot it up. And I mean, just from the people that I know, I mean, I think these things are probably, I don't know if people have really bothered to measure these kinds of things because it'd probably be bad optics for people who, for great reasons, want to discourage people from doing drugs. But most of the people that I know who have used heroin never became addicted. And the people who became addicted, I notice, all have some kind of fairly intense anxiety of some kind or another. Some of them have anxiety disorders. Some of them have PTSD that causes them great anxiety. But it was always an anxiety thing specifically. That was the common thread that I've noticed. And for me, I mean, I'm definitely not alone in being a bipolar person who's tried to damp down mania using heroin. And it doesn't work very well. If you're watching this video and you're thinking about self-medicating your mania with heroin, just don't bother because it's a lot of risk and not much reward. For me, like when I was manic, whenever I would try using heroin, I mean, I kind of always try it because um I didn't know what else to do. Like I didn't know about a lot of other options. I didn't know about good options. So I would try to do it that way and it just wouldn't work. It's hard to explain. Alcohol was the same way. Normally I'm a complete lightweight, but if I'm manic and I try to do downers, it's like I feel it for 10 minutes and then it's gone. It's like I never used the drug or drank the drink. It's just I have an insanely high tolerance for all downers. And there aren't very many, as far as I know, there aren't any drugs you can get recreationally that really do much for mania, beyond a very short term effect. Like, what you really need is a mood stabilizer or an antipsychotic, and people don't do those recreationally. Trazodone, if you can find it. I don't know if people really do that recreationally either, but I always found it kind of enjoyable. Um, and benzodiazepines I did find helped somewhat. But they don't help for very long. Even they're still better than heroin. Heroin is useless. And I got into this conversation recently with somebody actually, um, because a mutual acquaintance of ours, that we've known since high school, who has been a junkie pretty much. I mean, since high school, he's been a junkie, and he is, well, I don't know where he is now. When I was talking to my friend, our mutual acquaintance was in a mental hospital and he hadn't gotten a diagnosis yet. It was pretty clear he had some kind of psychosis. And my money's on schizoaffective disorder, but I don't really know. But he was asking me about this because he thought, I guess his girlfriend thought he was bipolar and thought that he had been using heroin to mask the symptoms. And I just find that very unlikely that that would work very well. And I remember being around him when he was doing heroin, and I find it very hard to believe he was manic and masking that, because he would just be like out. He'd be like a puddle on the floor. Um, anyway, what I do think is that he was using heroin to cope with the immense psychological stress of having constant delusional thinking and who knows what other symptoms that he hasn't actually told anybody about. A lot of schizoaffective people have like auditory hallucinations, and that kind of thing is very distressing, and a lot of people do drugs to escape from those. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like that was going on. So those are some other things that people will use heroin for. But like I said, I mean, I really think that the main thing is anxiety. Um, and for me, I mean, I'm not somebody who deals with a lot of anxiety. I'm a pretty low anxiety person, and I'm pretty, like, I started doing deep breathing exercises and meditation and stuff like that from a pretty young age. And um, I'm not saying I do get anxious sometimes, but not to the extent that like like most of the people that I know are, because like most of the people I know have some kind of other mental health issues, and anxiety um, is kind of a byproduct of a lot of mental health issues for most people. Because, like, or not even just mental health, but things like autism spectrum too. Like, a lot of autistic people have social anxiety. I don't. I sometimes fail socially, and I can realize that it's happening sometimes while it's happening and be very aware of it. And it's not what I would prefer to happen, but it's not something that makes me anxious. So anyway, what's my point? Anyway, the times that I would have anxiety, I would actually also sometimes use heroin to self-medicate for that, and that always worked really well. Like, say I was anxious about contacting somebody, um, for some reason, because maybe I was feeling insecure um, about them or something. So I would specifically use heroin and then call them, and then it would be fine. And I know for a lot of people that is more or less why they were using heroin, is because it made going through the day, having to talk to people, having to deal with everyday stressors manageable in a way that, like, normally when they're sober, it's not manageable. And maybe they don't, they're not, for whatever reason, using a less risky kind of medication, if you could call heroin a medication. But I guess it used to be, it used to be something that people used, that, like, reputable doctors prescribed to people. So I guess it's all relative. Um, but yeah, I mean, especially the people who develop serious habits. Like I said, I think there's this idea that all hard drugs, you do them once, like what they tell you in Dare, like, you do them once and then you're hooked forever. Um, I think the part of the reason that I didn't even ever get close to being hooked on heroin, despite using it fairly regularly for 5 years, is that I don't have this kind of anxiety issue that kept me coming back, that made me dependent on it, because it takes a while to get to the point where you're physically dependent. And I've watched that happen to people. It takes, months to 2 years, depending on how often they're using it and whatever other factors, before they're really physically dependent, before they start getting withdrawal symptoms and stuff. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to um, dive into it, you know, which I'm not saying it's like totally, I don't want to get into a debate over the, like, how free will plays into it. Um, but yeah, it kind of requires some work on some level to get into it. And for people who do have these kinds of anxiety problems, I think it does feel like the first time they do it, that's just what they want to do. They just know that's what they want to do because it's the first time they've felt free of anxiety since they can remember. And it's not something they can forget. And I would say, even for myself, and I think most people who have used it and enjoyed it, and by the way, not everybody enjoys it. I've met people who don't, but for the people that do, even if you don't get that into it, and this is kind of what inspired this whole video, is that you'll always have a kind of a nostalgia for it. Like, even if, no matter how much you know that that feeling is an illusion, no matter how much you know that it's dangerous and bad, no matter how much you have decided that you never want to do it again, there's always part of you that, when you remember, there's kind of like, it's like this temptress calling you, and you're instantly taken back to that dreamlike feeling, and you can't help it. You love it. You remember it forever. And that's part of what's so dangerous about it, because you can't undo that. I know there's an element of that for many drugs. I remember one time I was at a bus stop and I was talking to this woman, and she was telling me about how she had been sober from meth for a few years at that point. But she told me something that stuck with me. She said, no matter what happens in my life, no matter what I achieve, no matter what I do, I will never experience anything as exciting as shooting up meth. Like, I know that. And she, I mean, who knows what's happened to her? That was like 10 years ago, but she was trying to live her the rest of her life sober, knowing that her peak experience had already happened. Knowing that, no matter what kind of miraculous thing happens, the birth of her child, or it's just nothing is ever going to compare to that. I can't relate to that personally with any drug, but I can see how. I mean, it would just warp your whole rest of your life. You'd be changed. So, on a related topic, again, going back to heroin, I wanted to address the PTSD thing a little bit more specifically. I don't have PTSD, but I know a few people who became serious junkies because of PTSD. And I'm not going to go in depth about their stories because that's personal. But, one of them I remember told me that he felt like at that point in his life, it was something that he needed. Um, Probably there ideally could have been a better way to do it than becoming a junkie for like 10 years, I think. He was a junkie for quite a while, living on the streets. Um, but it did, for whatever it's worth, um, allow him the emotional space to process some very serious things that happened to him. I mean, he's somebody who has what's termed complex PTSD, that he had his early childhood. I mean, he was in a cult. His family was in a cult. So you can imagine what kinds of things would come with that. Um, and he's spent, his whole adult life trying to process these things. And he suffered from constant dissociation for a long time. It's been a really long struggle, but becoming a junkie was part of that. And for him, I mean, he at least felt like it was what it needed to be for him in that time, which is a perspective. I certainly, again, I'm not encouraging anybody to do that. I think there are better things that you can do ideally if you have access to them. But that's how he used it to process his emotions, because he just couldn't do it without something to kind of numb those emotions. And that's very much what heroin does. There's a line in Golden Brown, that song, that comes up a few times. We say, never a frown with Golden Brown. And you notice that, like, the whole song, I mean, it's not happy though. Like, never a frown, but there's not really a smile either. And it is very enjoyable. It is a very enjoyable experience, obviously, but it's one that very much takes all of your feelings and gives you some space from them. Another person who I met once, I mean, this guy, I don't remember the context. I started a conversation with him on the bus. Um, this poor guy, he was an Iraq war vet. He was deployed at the beginning of the Iraq war, and he was, well, I don't remember how long he was there. This was shortly after, he'd been discharged. So again, this was 10 plus years ago that I had this conversation. But he was a young guy, not much older than I was at the time, which had been like early 20s. And this guy was so traumatized. I remember he told me, because we wound up getting off at the same stop, and he told me about some of his experiences, um, having like he I'm trying to remember this correctly, but it was something like he killed a child because she had a bomb. Like, and he said that he couldn't sleep, and he couldn't sleep unless he did heroin, because if he didn't, um, he would just he would dream about her on repeat, and he'd wake up and he wouldn't get any sleep. He'd just be, covered in sweat, um, heart beating out of his chest all night, every night. He was on the verge of homelessness, and he was not getting care from the VA, and he was doing heroin. That was just the only way he could cope. So I'm telling these stories specifically because, um, I mean, I've also known some people who I really just thought were pieces of um, excrement who were junkies too. So I'm not, obviously any group of people, you're going to have some diversity of, like, who these people are, and what kind of character they have. But I guess I'm saying this, I'm telling, I'm referencing these people's stories to give people some context for why people become junkies, because I mean, it's not necessarily like there's some sob story, but usually there's a reason. Usually there's something that's driving them to seek out this numbed experience over and over again, that they're dealing with extreme pain. And I've heard that opiate chemicals mimic those that we get when we are experiencing affection and closeness with people, which I think, you know, put in that context, it's not very surprising that there'd be suddenly this huge opioid epidemic, um, in our country, because we're a very isolated people more and more right now. We're very socially isolated. And, I mean, here right now, we're all following each other on these digital platforms, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but I think a lot of people, that's starting to replace actual in person contact, physical contact, affection. We need these things to help us process things emotionally. We need these things to calm our nerves. And I think there's the relationship with anxiety and with emotional processing in something like, when we're traumatized. I mean, I don't want to make it as simple as like, oh, we just need more hugs, because that just brings to mind some whole other Orwellian nightmare where, like, there's some government bureaucrat showing up and forcing us to be hugged or something. But we but it's so important that we comfort each other when we're distressed. I think more and more people, at least a lot of people I know, tend to think of contact with other people as being just something stressful and just something that actually induces anxiety, and people retreat into their little spaces. And it certainly can be that way. Like, being around people can be horrible, but if we can approach each other with more love and more genuine affection, that of course comes with, respect, that is of course very consensual, um, because it's coming from a place of love, and just helping each other cope with the horror of being a human being. Hopefully we won't seek out as many dangerous crutches to rely on. So I'll leave it at that. Please comment if you have any thoughts or questions. If I said anything that you think is horribly wrong, or if you have an experience to share or anything. I really want to hear it. And I will link the playlist that I made of songs that remind me of heroin if you are curious. It's down there, and I have to admit these are definitely nostalgia songs for me. That is what it is. So have a good one. Don't do heroin. Hug your friends.